next segment of our event, where we will have Dr. S Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, give us a keynote address on the launch of the Indian Ocean Initiative, and followed by a conversation with Ashley Tellis. Ashley, I will hand it over to you. Minister Jaishankar, welcome, and thank you so much for making time. Ashley, over to you.
Well, thank you, Darshana. I cannot tell you what a privilege it is and what a pleasure it is for me personally to welcome Dr. Jaishankar, India's Minister for External Affairs, back to the Carnegie Endowment. I have very fond memories of the many occasions in which he visited the endowment. And actually, if memory serves, on at least 2 occasions, offering a quite masterful address about the way India sees its relationship with the United States and in the world. And so my only regret today is that I have to speak to him across an electronic medium, as opposed to speaking to him in the same room. But all the same, I want to welcome him here because it is really important to us what his presence signifies. He, of course, needs no introduction, but he deserves one. And I'm going to give him the briefest of introductions. Just to remind any of the folks who have tuned in, who may have forgotten, he's had a very distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service. He served as India's ambassador successively to the Czech Republic, to Singapore, to China, and the United States, before retiring literally at the acme of his bureaucratic profession when he served as Foreign Secretary. He was also pivotal, actually, to the achievement of the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, right from its early days, when it existed in embryonic form as the new steps of strategic partnership, all the way to the end, when we completed the many serial steps in the completion of the agreement. He's had a career in the private sector, where he worked for the Tatas, and is also the author of a remarkable book called The India Way, which I reviewed actually for Carnegie a few months ago, and which I would commend to the readership of all those viewing here. Because of the program that we have today, which is on the Indian Ocean and the launch of this initiative, I really think there's no better person to address this gathering. Because other than Prime Minister Modi, Dr. Jaishankar has been the staunchest champion of India returning as a maritime power in the Indo-Pacific space. He has consistently made the argument that India should be ramping up its investments to sustain the return to the maritime role that it once played prior to the colonial era. And if India succeeds in that ambition, it will be due to, in no small measure, because of the efforts that he is making in his current role as Minister of External Affairs and as a member of the Cabinet Committee on Security. So without further ado, I want to welcome you, Dr. Jaishankar. It is wonderful to see you. I will give you the floor to offer brief remarks, and then I hope we will have the opportunity to have a conversation. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you. Ashley, Darshana, let me say it's really great to be back with Carnegie. And like you, Ashley, I'm thankful that we still connect, but I would have much rather connected, of course, in person. So what I thought was just to kick off a discussion on the conversation on the Indian Ocean. Let me share with you some points which, to me, lay out a kind of an Indian perspective of the Indian Ocean. I try to sort of discipline my thoughts into 8 points. So I will put those 8 points out. And the first point is really that, unlike the last few centuries, when the developments in the oceans determine the course of events on land, today we are actually seeing that logic inverted to some extent. You have facilities in littoral states, including those set up through connectivity initiatives, actually having very significant maritime implications. So I would argue that the sea-land dynamic is still a dynamic, but not quite the way it was before. Okay. The second point I would make is that the Indian Ocean itself historically had an organic unity. And I think that's very, very important today for Indian Ocean countries to recall and, in a sense, I won't say reinvent, but certainly refresh. A lot of that organic unity, of course, derived from the monsoons. And the monsoons were the sort of the driving force of the Indian Ocean activity. It was in many ways, of course, a very pluralistic, very syncretic culture of the Indian Ocean. I'll come to that later. And that the era of Western imperialism actually broke this up. I mean, what the period, those 200 years plus did was, it created very distinct sub-regions, like the Indian subcontinent, like the Gulf, like Southeast Asia. And in a sense, compartmentalized them. Today, actually interfacing them again is a very big challenge. Certainly when India talks about Indian foreign policy today, talks about neighborhood first, which is consolidation within the Indian subcontinent, but then talks about Act East policy towards Southeast Asia or link west towards the Gulf. This is a rebuilding of linkages to the extended neighborhood, which was broken up in these 200 years. And also, I think, in many ways, by the partition of India. Because I think that was a very serious strategic event whose full consequences is not always appreciated by people. The third point I would flag for attention today is that considering that we have such a large coastline, a vast expanse of ocean below us, so many islands, it's interesting that it's only in 2015 that India actually formally adopted a comprehensive maritime strategy. And this was done when Prime Minister Modi went to Mauritius in March of 2015. He gave it the acronym of SAGAR, which is a word for ocean in Hindi. But what it has done, this comprehensive view, it has actually created, I would say, outlook cutting across bureaucracies and departmental silos. So you've seen much more maritime activity and maritime commitments. You've seen a ramp up of HADR operations. There have been 7 big ones, actually, without counting even the COVID-related operations. A large number of coastal surveillance agreements with Indian Ocean partners. Light shipping agreements with 22 countries. Many more are still in the pipeline. A hydrographic cooperation with 6 countries. And military training in the Indian Ocean region with 11 countries. All in all, actually, India has acquired the reputation of being a first responder. And to that extent, I would say it's a kind of a theory, it's a praxis example. You create the theory, you then implement it, and that strengthens the theory. The fourth point, which I touched on earlier in my remarks, is the Indian Ocean has actually got a very strong ethos, very strong culture of coexistence, of adjustment, of diversity. And in that sense, it really underpins a multipolar Asia, which is really a key building block for a multipolar world. So today, I would kind of work that logic backwards. You want a multipolar world, you need a multipolar Asia. You want a multipolar Asia, you need to make the Indian Ocean culture of diversity and pluralism succeed. My fifth point, the centrality of the Indian Ocean to global development has actually grown in the last few decades. And it has grown because of the rebalancing in the world order. That as Asia's salience has increased, as Asia's economic weight has increased, as trade routes have grown, There's been a strategic consequence to all of that. And this is important to an audience which has historically been more focused on the Atlantic and the Pacific to understand. So when you think in power terms, in national terms of a rebalancing, and say, okay, China and India, say, have grown much bigger, Asia's growth in weight has increased. Do look at the maritime, the parallel maritime rebalancing which has taken place, which is actually the Indian Ocean has gained in prominence and significance as compared to the Pacific and the Atlantic. My sixth point would be that we have, after the Second World War, treated the Pacific and the Indian Ocean as very distinct theaters. And there's a good reason for it. A lot of it is to do with the United States. I think because the United States was so dominant in the Pacific and was, the immediate post-war strategy was very Japan-centered. Then there were the events in China, the Korean War, eventually leading on to the Vietnam War. In a sense, Pacific was more American, and at least in the 50s, Indian Ocean was more British. And then, as as British power receded, you actually had, I would say, a definitional wall between them, different degrees of commitments, different degrees of presence. But that separation between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, I think, has become less and less tenable. I would argue partly because the Northeast Asian countries are today much more visible in the Indian Ocean, Japan, Korea, most of all China. And the Indian Ocean countries, many of them, especially India, much more visible in the Pacific. And the United States actually treating the Indian and the Pacific in a much more integrated manner than it has ever done before. So Indo-Pacific, it's very difficult today to talk of the Indian Ocean without really going into the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific, I don't think is anymore an argument or a debate. I think it's pretty much a reality. It is definitely a policy for a lot of countries. So we need to take that as an assumption. Now, my second point, within the Indian Ocean, within the Indo-Pacific, we have actually seen cooperation grow very rapidly, variety of reasons. Now, typically, I don't say this as a criticism, but we, in our business, and particularly your business, Ashley, you tend to look at it much more as hard security. Whereas I would say it's both the reality warrants and I would even say the politics warrant a much more rounded approach that we look at a lot of other factors other than hard security. And an interesting initiative in this context is actually one which India had tabled at the East Asia Summit 2 years ago. It's called the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, and it has 8 pillars. It looks at ecology, environment, connectivity, obviously, the educational, scientific exchanges, and there's been, COVID, of course, has disrupted some of this, but already the Australians, the Japanese, the Indonesians, the French have all bought into it by agreeing to lead various pillars in this basket of it. And my final point, the changes which I've spoken about, the rebalancing, the need to treat the Indian and the Pacific Ocean as a much more integrated setup. The political reflection of a lot of these changes is expressed in the Quad. And again, I want to highlight that the Quad has an agenda which extends to multiple domains, to much broader cooperation. I think to keep it, to make it, in a sense, give it a sharp edge and a very limited agenda, partly I think is a gamesmanship of critics, but I think it's partly also, frankly, a headlines kind of attitude, not a full understanding of really what is happening. Because I think, as we will see later on in the month, I think the Quad has a increasing agenda, a substantive agenda, which will actually cover multiple spheres of activities. But again, without in any way diminishing Quad, I also want to point out that Quad is not unique, that there are other plurilaterals. I mean, there are other plurilaterals in the world, but there are other plurilaterals even in the Indo-Pacific region. And we ourselves, when I look at it, we have plurilaterals, which means more than two, arrangement with Australia and Japan, but also with Indonesia, with France, with Sri Lanka, with the Maldives. In a sense, this is a larger generic point on the evolution of the international order, that as multilateralism shows an inability to deliver on the key issues of the day, and as bilateralism has its limits, I think that gap is today increasingly going to be filled with understandings and activities of the willing and the cooperative. And international relations today has to take that into account, rather than debating whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because it's there, it's part of life. So these are some of my initial thoughts. But once again, really thank you for having me over today digitally, and once again, really my good wishes, and I'd be happy to begin the conversation with you, Ashley.
Well, thank you so very much. First, of course, thank you for making the time, and thank you for offering those very thoughtful remarks. In some ways, you've made my life really harder, because the richness of your remarks encompasses such a broad array of themes that I think it will be virtually impossible to engage every one of them. But there were three themes that, just listening to you speak, jump out at me. And so I want to engage you on each of those three themes sort of sequentially. The first is the continuing sort of dialectical tension between fragmentation and unification. You mentioned the colonial legacy and the contribution that it made. I wonder whether those pressures for fragmentation still do not persist. May not be in a colonial guise, but in the guise that there are new architectures, new infrastructure plans, et cetera, that have had the consequence of actually dividing the region in many ways, rather than achieving that ambition of unification. In other words, if there are geopolitical pressures that are pushing for fragmentation, can this fragmentation be overcome by alternative instruments relating to economic integration, soft security, and so on and so forth? How do you see the struggle between fragmentation and unification today going forward?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and quite honestly, Ashley, you kind of improved on my observation. I think you've set it out in a very, very sharp conceptual way. Look, in a sense, I would argue both fragmentation and unification are extreme positions. Fragmentation could be past fragmentation, there could be new fragmentations, and where if while we want more integration, if that happens in a sense under the rubric of a much more unipolar worldview, then I would argue that that is obviously not in the overall interest of the region. So as always, or not as always, but as very often, I think the best answers lie somewhere in the middle, which is why the middle path is embodied with so many virtues. And to me, the middle, getting the balance right would be actually create a much more participative, much more consultative, in a sense, a much more coordinated, cooperative kind of Indo-Pacific. Now, I recognize it's easier said than done. And, some weeks ago, I had actually spoken at some length in Australia and in the ANU, contrasting how actually Europe has dealt with these challenges as opposed to Asia. And the fact is, we in Asia are struggling with it for a variety of reasons. So I think a lot of what you are going to see now, which you already see, these are those efforts, and certainly I think I'm just giving you Quad as an example because of my last comment. It is an effort at cooperation. It is an effort at cooperation between four countries who are actually located in a sense at four corners of the Indo-Pacific, but who are all impelled by a sense of responsibility for global good and duty towards the global commons, who have found it possible, who have the comfort today to work with each other. Mind you, each one has made an extra effort. I mean, it wasn't something which was predestined. In fact, recent history was a little different. But they've all tried to overcome that, approach their global responsibilities with a more open mind, and I think are trying to say, okay, how do we work with this? Now, I think that the other efforts, as I said, there are many trilaterals out there. The East Asia Summit and the ASEAN forums also themselves add to some of this. So you will have, it's a big region. It's a very complicated region. It will have many building blocks of many kinds. And the right thing is to be open to all of them rather than, get into a very sort of binary with me against me kind of output.
Yes. I was actually just remarking to Darshana before you came on the line, Mr. Minister, that the success of the US, particularly in the Indo-Pacific space, will depend so much on our attentiveness to the concerns of individual players in the region, which is instead of thinking of them as purely objects in a larger contest, to sort of internalize their concerns and work with them. Now, you mentioned in your remarks the effort and the investments that India is making, for example, with respect to HADR, with respect to maritime cooperation, in environmental management, disaster relief, the whole 9 yards. The question that lurks at the back of my mind is that will these investments in what you might call low politics, and by that I don't mean it's unimportant, but just the world outside of geopolitical competition, will these investments in low politics suffice to bring the region closer to the unity that you described as once characteristic prior to the era of colonialism? Or will these efforts become victims of these larger tectonic struggles at the level of high politics? Just practically, given the investments that you've seen India make in the last 3 to 4 years, how do you see this shaping up?
Well, look, theoretically, your question is a valid one. Obviously, anybody who's in the policy-making world would like to see the best outcomes of their policy. So my answers are inherently biased here, which is I would like to see this succeed. I would like to see greater cooperation. We have tried not to play into a polarized world sort of scenario. So I'm not suggesting it would be easy. I'm also not in denial of the realities of geopolitics. After all, I do it for a living. But my sense is it should be our endeavor to try to widen the areas of convergence and commonalities, because that is how regions actually develop. My sense is if you actually ask people philosophically and even practically, saying, look, would you like to see some kind of lowest common denominator which is continuously raised in terms of what are the common interests of the region? I think almost everybody would say yes. Now, there will be, when there are difficult relationships, I think they will have to be, in a sense, reconciled with this direction. That process will have its challenges. But again, I would argue that such a vision, and it's not just a vision, I think there is a practical basis for it, actually will have a dampening effect on very sharp competition. That, as it is, in a sense, globalization is a constraining force.
Yes.
In the way international competition works. But I would argue that the more platforms you have, the more people work with each other, the larger the consensus. I think all of this will be contributing. So, to my mind, rather than you post it in sense of unification, fragmentation, I would also say stability, instability. To my mind, these are all stabilizing. We'll never have perfect stability, but there'll certainly be mitigative and contributive factors to how the region would develop.
And you have a great asset going in, and the asset you have growing in is that almost every country in the region shares these goals, as you pointed out. Every country in the region wants to protect its independence, wants to protect prosperity, wants to deepen the linkages. The question I have, and I want to transition to a second theme in a minute, but the last question I have on this theme is, do you believe that the community of countries that care about freedom and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific are applying the right quantum of resources to attaining these objectives? Or is there still a gap between what our aspirations would require us to do and what we're actually doing?
In the real world, actually, there'll always be a gap. There will always be a gap because our aspirations will always be ahead of reality. Our promises will always be ahead of performance. It's in the nature. It's in the nature of public policy making. Again, if you look at it, a lot of countries, even before the COVID, but especially after the COVID, are extremely concerned about rebuilding at home, most notably the United States. And therefore, a lot of foreign policy and strategic postures will be based, they will not be capability driven or resources driven. They will be capability and resources optimized. But we'll have limited capability and resources. The task will be bigger than those capability and resources can address. And my senses will both be creative on how we use it, but creative also in terms of understandings and arrangements. And I think if you look at the evolution in the thinking of many, many countries in the Indo-Pacific, one of the big changes today is the fact that there's a greater willingness to work with others. And the United States, I think, in my view, has been especially notable in making that transition.
I want to use this as the opportunity to transition to the second big theme that I saw coming out of your remarks. And that is the persistent invocation, explicit and implicit, about the importance of multipolarity and the emergence of multipolarity. Not just multipolarity in Asia, but multipolarity in Asia as a stepping stone to multipolarity globally, with all the implications for stability thereof. Now, this takes us into a somewhat, uncomfortable area. And that is, do you have the sense that while India has a vision of a multipolar Asia, that vision is shared to a greater or lesser degree by the other Asian states as well? And what are the implications of the differences in perception on that count?
The answer to that would be that most of the major states in Asia would subscribe to multipolarity. Okay. Now, here is the sort of dilemma of international relations. When power reaches a point where you feel, remember, multipolarity doesn't mean equal poles.
Yes.
It means poles of multiple weightages. I think more enlightened policies would look at an architecture, would look at a long-term sort of stability and as a factor, would to a greater degree perhaps respect the interests of others, because it's in your own interest that they too have a level of comfort, because that comfort really creates greater stability. Now, I cannot guarantee that everybody would necessarily have that kind of sober, enlightened, far-seeing view of a evolving architecture, because the history of the world has shown that has from time to time not been the case. But if you ask me, would the bulk of the countries subscribe to a multipolar Asia? Yes, I think in a sense, the overall sense, feeling would be not just for multipolarity, because in some cases it would be national multipolarity, but we have, for example, the ASEAN, which is in many ways a very successful collective, where there are actually, certainly in Asia, it has been the most successful regional organization. And it has a fairly well-developed sense of its collective interests.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at multipolarity, to me, ASEAN, for example, would be a pole. Maybe even within ASEAN, a very important country like Indonesia would be a pole. So keeping that in mind, I think generally there would be a strong support for multipolarity, for a more democratic, consultative sort of decision making and deliberative way of managing Asia. In many ways, the East Asia summit process, the ARF, the ADMM, all these are all sort of platforms which contribute to that. But we are still in a relatively, I would say, early stage of evolution. When you compare it to Europe, for instance, yes, you can see the difference. But I do take the point that what kind of multipolarity, and for example, to me, multipolarity would not be uniform, but would not be hierarchical. So
I'm glad you raised that last point, because to my mind, that is the rub of the whole question. You can have a multipolarity in terms of differences and capabilities, but does that then translate into limitations on one's autonomy and freedom to choose. And if you have a vision of multipolarity that is hierarchical, with states progressively losing their autonomy depending on where they fit into the scale, then that's certainly not the multipolarity, obviously, that you would consider to be desirable.
Actually, all I can say is India did not accept a hierarchy when India was very much weaker. I mean, if you look at the 1950s and 60s, the purpose of non-alignment was exactly to expand our
Space.
space and ability to make choices. And it was also a very clear sense that, the world will change. Time is with us. We will go up the ladder. And sure enough, 75 years later, I think we can, the world has evolved. We have evolved. In the earlier phases, we used to worry about how to maneuver between poles. Today, we would be moving in the direction of becoming one of the poles. I think there's still a lot of space there to be covered. But certainly, I don't think anybody can make a credible case to Indians or in India why we should accept constraining of choices or, hierarchical order.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, because I think that is really what is at the minds of many, particularly in the United States. I know your time is really at a premium, but I do want to ask you just one last question, because it was such an important theme in your 8 points, and that is the whole issue of rebalancing. The United States has expressed an intention to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific, and you have seen our own discussions in this country now going back, over 10 years. I want to ask you about India's challenges with respect to rebalancing, and in particular, the dilemma that India faces with respect to its continental versus its maritime commitments. It seems to me that one of the consequences of our departure from Afghanistan is that the security environment in India's continental spaces has become more complicated. Partly because there is a threat of the resurgence of terrorism, partly because the overarching ideas about jihadism triumphant have not been extinguished, and partly because new players now have emerged on the scene with the capability to cause India real harm. The question I have for you is, what bearing will these challenges have on India's ability to play in this bigger maritime space? Will there be distractions in terms of constraints on leadership time? Will there be constraints in terms of resources that you can apply, and so on and so forth? How do you see India juggling between the continental and the maritime challenges?
Before I come to that, if I can just say a few words about rebalancing itself, because rebalancing is a very broad, sweeping term, and it all depends on the domain to which you apply it. And the parameters which actually go into your definition of rebalancing. Obviously, economic rebalancing was one, in a way, I would say the primary driver. Definitely political and capability rebalancing, which comes with that. But I think there is also, to a great extent, the next phase, which is a kind of a cultural and a narratives rebalancing. Certainly, I think one of the challenges today is to get people to have a balanced appreciation that the progress of India doesn't mean India looks more and more like the West. In fact, the progress of India will mean India looks more and more like India. And it's time that people in the Western world, particularly in the United States, have actually a better understanding of what that means. I would say the fact that in many ways, concepts which we share, practices we share, values we share, will express themselves in a diverse way, precisely because we are located in different parts of the world with different histories. Now, in terms of the continental versus maritime, again, there are two aspects or three aspects to it. One, as I pointed out, especially after 2015, there's been a much greater Indian focus on maritime.
Yes.
Number two, as you grow, but your challenges also grow, the entire exercise is about optimizing. As I said, show me there are very few countries in the world which will speak of a surfeit of resources. And certainly that's a much harder situation in democratic societies, where there is so much pressure today to address the immediate problems of quality of life and so on. What you said about Afghanistan and the resulting complications, the way you put it. Again, look, I'm not. I often read an analysis about, do you have the bandwidth? I mean, can you give attention to two problems? I mean, people in governance give attention to 100 problems at the same time, and governance and policy making is not for people with a narrow bandwidth. It is, in fact, this ability to address multiple challenges, prioritize, optimize, to some extent pursue parallel tracks, sometimes even contradictory tracks. I mean, this is really what governance and policy making is about. So I do see your point about the greater complexity of challenges we face in our own national security environment. But to my mind, the part of the answers, I say this as a foreign minister, part of the security's answers lie in foreign policy. It's my responsibility to ensure that my country has the understandings with partners abroad, and which may be very different partners. My partners, let us say, in addressing the challenges which come out of Afghanistan, would be very, very different from, or could be very different from my partners with whom I work with on the Indo-Pacific. So it is this ability to shall I say, broaden our set of partners, keep those relationships well-oiled, make sure there are enough convergences and overlaps for for good working understanding. I think this is part of the challenge, and I would say today's foreign policy. I mean, first of all, it at one level it's more issues are much more integrated, but very often you have to work with partners of choice on issues of choice. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in theaters of choice, they could be different, and I think that makes foreign policy a much more complicated game with many more variables.
Well, I want to thank you on that note for your customarily sophisticated and subtle answers to many of the questions that I posed. For us, this is really a wonderful opportunity to hear you up close on issues that are not going away. And I only hope that we will have more occasions to engage with you as your time and circumstances permit, and that before too long, we will actually be able to welcome you once again in person at the endowment itself. As you can well imagine, the building is shut right now. We are in the process of a slow comeback, but hopefully within a few months, when travel begins in earnest and things hopefully go back to normal, we'll have a chance to see you in person in Washington. But let me really take the opportunity to thank you for spending the time today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.